So this seeded scotoma now starts progressing above and below the fixation point to reach the horizontal line on the other side nasally, but it does not cross the horizontal line because it respects the horizontal raphe, then such an arc-like scotoma is called the arcuate scotoma. And if it is because it's present in the germs area, it is also called the germs scotoma. To the normal extent or the field of vision, it is very important. So if you see, superiorly the field extends up to the 50 degrees, nasally it is about 60 degrees, inferiorly it is about 70 degrees, and temporally
Hello,
it is about
Leon.
90 degrees. So if you can see, this is the point of fixation, okay, and this lady is able to see apart from the point of fixation an area around the point of fixation, and that is called the field of vision. And as you can see, the field of vision is maximum in the temporal area, that is about 90 degrees. So what is meant by the blind spot? Now we should know, first important point that you should know is that the normal blind spot is about 15 degrees temporal to the fixation, and the measurements of the blind spot is 6 degrees in the width and 8 degrees in the height. So let me explain it to you what is meant by the blind spot. The blind spot corresponds to basically the optic nerve inside the eye. Now, as we know that this is the retina, and the information from the retina is being carried by the optic nerve. Now, the optic nerve is a place where actually we do not have proper retina. It is like a vacuum, or it is like an empty space. So therefore, the area of the retina corresponding to the optic nerve does not does not contribute to any visual field, or does not contribute to vision. And since that area of the retina is not corresponding to the visual field, that is why it is called a blind spot. Okay. Now, in our normal eyes, if you see, this is the nose. Okay, and it is, that means, in the temporal area, and that is the reason why the blind spot is present in the visual field temporally. Okay, the visual fields are always opposite to what we see in the retina. So the nasal retina corresponds to the temporal visual field, the temporal retina corresponds to the nasal visual fields, and therefore, since the optic nerve is located in the nasal part of the retina, the blind spot is located in the temporal part of the retina, and the blind spot is about 15 degrees from this point of fixation, and as I already told you, the width is 6 degrees and the height is about 8 degrees. Now coming to certain important terminologies that we must all know before going to the visual field effects in glaucoma. So number one is, what is meant by scotoma? A scotoma is basically an area of reduced sensitivity surrounded by a more sensitive area or a normal area. So if you see, this is a blind spot also is a scotomatous area. Now if you can see this area marked in black color, it is surrounded by the normal retina or the normal visual field, and therefore this area is called a scotoma, right? So scotoma is an abnormal area surrounded by a more sensitive or a normal area. However, this does not apply to the depression. Depression means there is an area of reduced sensitivity, but that area also is surrounded by an abnormal area which does not have the sensitivity closer to the normal retina. So as you can see, this black area I have drawn, so this is a generalized field depression, and you can see surrounding that also there's a gray area which is also abnormal. Okay, so that is called depression. So that is very important, the difference between scotoma and depression. So scotoma is more well defined compared to depression. Coming to eye softer. Eye softer is nothing but, when we actually measure the visual fields, we are measuring the sensitivity of various points on the retina, okay, in decibels. So if you find sensitivities like this, okay, and say this 32 decibels here, 32 decibels here, and if it is 32 decibels in all these points, and we join these points, what we get is an eye softer. So eye softer is nothing but, it's a threshold line which joins the points of equal sensitivity on the visual field chart. So this could be one isopter, this is another isopter, and this is another isopter. The meaning of isopter is that every point which is going to lie on this circle they're going to have equal retinal sensitivity.
Hello,
Okay?
Nativat.
Then course, I told you what is meant by fixation.
Hola.
Fixation is a part of the visual field which is corresponding to the fovea centralis. So this part is the fixation point, and from here is your blind spot, which is located 15 degrees temporal to the point of fixation. Now, this picture is very important because here I want to tell you what is meant by the central field, what is meant by peripheral field, and what is meant by the germs area. Now, the portion of the visual field which is present within 30 degrees of fixation, that means this is the point of fixation, and if you can see these circles which are drawn from this point of fixation, they are drawn at various degrees. So this is 10 degrees, 20 degrees and 30 degrees. Now, if you consider the entire area which is present within this 30 degree circle, this is called the central field of vision. And the entire area which is present outside this 30 degrees of field of vision, that is represented as the peripheral field of vision.
¿Cómo estás,
Now,
Nativat?
then what is meant by the germs area? Now, the germs area, however,
Si te gusta mi arte,
sigue
sigue mi canal, por favor.
which is present within 25 degrees of fixation. So this is fixation, this is 20, this is 30. So in between this, there will be a 25 degree circle if you draw, and that area between this 25 degree circle is called the germs area. It goes behind the name of the scientist who discovered a lot of scotoma occurring in glaucoma patient within this 25 degree circle, and therefore it is called the germs area. Now, before you understand the field effects in glaucoma, it is very important to understand the distribution of fibers in the retina. So this diagram is going to help us understand how the various nerve fibers are entering the optic disc. They do not enter in a very simple way, however, they follow a specific pattern. So let us see. The nasal retina, as you can see, the nasal retina that is present on this side of the optic disc, okay, they are going to enter as radiating fibers from the nasal side. So the ones coming from the superior, they are going to form the superior radial fibers, and the ones coming from the inferior, they are going to form the inferior radial fibers, right? So the nasal retina is going to come to the optic disc in the form of superior and inferior radiating fibers, and they're going to occupy the nasal part of the optic disc. The macular area, however, is going to go straight ahead into the optic nerve, and it is going to form what is known as the papillomacular bundle, represented here as PMD. Then we have the temporal retina. The temporal retinal fibers, they actually forming an arch. They form an arch over this papillomacular bundle and over the macular areas, and this is how they are going to insert inside the superior temporal part and the inferior temporal part of the optic disc. So the fibers which are entering into the superior temporal part here, they are called the superior arcuate fibers.
Welcome to my channel.
And the ones which are inserting into the inferior part
If
of
you
the
just
disc,
join
they
in,
are
I'm
called
drawing
the inferior arcuate fibers.
Gohan.
Now, an important point about these arcuate fibers is that, as you can see, these arcuate fibers, they're never crossing the midline. Okay, they respect a midline, they respect a horizontal boundary, and that horizontal boundary is called the horizontal raphe. So I hope that is clear regarding the distribution of fibers in the retina. So as I told you, here if this is the optic disc, consider of the left eye, this is the macular area. The macular area here, okay, is the most temporal part of the disc, is receiving the macular fibers and receiving the papillomacular bundle. Now the superior temporal part and the inferior temporal part, they are receiving basically the arcuate fibers, okay, and we know that the arcuate fibers are coming from the temporal retina, right? So this is the temporal retina. They are coming as the superior and the inferior arcuate fibers, and they are occupying the superior temporal and the inferior temporal parts of the optic disc. Then we have the radiating fibers. Radiating fibers are coming from the nasal part, and they are coming into the superior nasal and the inferior nasal part of the disc. And these nasal fibers will not respect the horizontal raphe. However, the temporal fibers are definitely going to respect this horizontal raphe, and what do I mean by respecting horizontal raphe is that they will not cross beyond this. The superior fibers are not going to go into the inferior zone, and the inferior fibers are not going to go into the superior zone. So that is very, very important. Now, how is it? How are these distributed inside the optic nerve? Now, this optic nerve, if you see, the deeper fibers are the more peripheral fibers. That means the fibers which are coming more anteriorly, they are present the most deeper inside the retina, and however, as they enter the optic nerve, they are going to be the most superficial. However, the fibers which are coming more posteriorly towards near the optic disc, okay, they are going to be more superficial inside the retina, okay, inside the retina, and when they go into the optic nerve, they are going to be more central. So you can remember it as the fibers which are coming from the anterior retina, they are deeper in the retina and they are superficial, however, in the optic nerve. However, the fibers which are closer to the optic disc, they will be superficial in the retina, but they will be deeper inside the optic nerve. So that is very important. Now the question arises, which all of us are waiting for, is which fibers are the most sensitive to glaucomatous damage? And the answer here is the arcuate nerve fibers. They are the most sensitive to glaucomatous damage, and they stop graphic. Now the question is, why are the arcuate fibers more susceptible, or why are they involved earlier? Okay. So here again I would like to remind you that we are talking about the superior arcade fibers and the inferior arcade fibers, and they are the ones which are more commonly affected and more susceptible. The reason is, number one reason is the watershed theory. The watershed theory says that the superior and the inferior poles of the optic nerve, they contribute to what is called as the watershed areas. A watershed area is a zone which is supplied by two blood supply, which has dual blood supply. So the thing about dual blood supply is that the distal part of these blood supply will be very very thinner arteries. So whenever there is hypoperfusion, this area, this watershed zone will be actually compromised because of decreased blood supply in these areas, right? So the superior and the inferior poles of the optic nerve, they form the watershed areas, and that is the reason why they are more susceptible to get involved in glaucoma. Now, as you can see, this is actually a picture taken from a journal in which they ligated or obliterated the lateral posterior ciliary artery. So you can see there is no filling, or there's a filling defect on FFA here. So this picture actually shows you that the medial PCA is supplying the medial part of the optic nerve and the medial retina. Okay, and the temporal part of the optic nerve is entirely supplied by the lateral part of the optic nerve is entirely supplied by the lateral posterior ciliary artery. So definitely the superior and the inferior pole, or the superior temporal or the inferior temporal folds, they form the watershed areas, and therefore they are involved more in glaucoma. The second theory, which tells you that why the superior temporal and the inferior temporal poles are affected more, is the porous theory or the pores theory. The pores theory says that when the electron microscopy or the ultrastructural examination was done, you can see that the pores in the lamina fibrosa, which are present in the superior temporal and the inferior temporal region, they're much bigger compared to the pores which are present in the other parts, right? So what happens is, if the pores are bigger, the extracellular matrix, or the external support to the nerve fibers which are going to pass through this bigger pores, will be less. So because they do not have that excessive support or good framework because of the larger pores, whenever the pressure rises, the compression of these optic nerve fibers which are passing through these larger pores will be greater, and that is the reason the damage will be greater at the pores. Now, after you know which fibers are more susceptible, the next question is which fibers are more resistant. Okay, and here the answer is the macular fibers are the more resistant. So now I told you that
I
the
have to
arcade
go.
fibers
I'll
are
continue
affected
this drawing
most,
tomorrow.
and in that it is the
Thank you
inferior
for joining
arcade
my live.
fibers which
Thank you
are
for
more
subscribing to
affected,
my channel.
and over here in the optic nerve we
Thank you so
have the
much. I'll
inferior
see you guys
vulnerability
tomorrow.
zone as well, and that is the reason why the superior visual field effect is
Bye.
more common. Okay, so the arcade fibers are more affected, and in those
Hello
arcade
guys.
fibers as well,
Thank
it
you
is the
for subscribing
inferior
to my
arcade
channel.
fibers which are
If you
more
like my art,
affected,
kindly
and
subscribe.
therefore
See you
there is
guys
superior
tomorrow.
visual field effect. Now Second
Bye.
in number is the radiating fibers, that is nasal fibers, and the last to be affected is the macular fibers. So that is why we might